I am so excited to introduce our opening keynote of the day. I'll come back on stage after with some housekeeping and logistics, but we're going to jump right in. Simone Stolzoff is the best-selling author of an amazing book, The Good Enough Job. He has a new book coming out next year called How to Not Know. He was recently on Main Stage TED, and he has made a study of across industries and across cultures, how do we live in uncertain times? How do we adapt amidst uncertainty? How do we do work differently? And how do we do it better together? I have a tradition at Responsive Conference. You've all come from all over the world to meet each other and also listen to incredible speakers on stage. But also, I'm a dancer, I'm an acrobat, I like to get up and move. So I'm going to encourage every time we have somebody on stage, if you will stand with me. Normally, like the very best speakers get a standing ovation, maybe if they're very fortunate. But I think that if we ask of our speakers the most, right, we ask them to deliver the very best of their ideas and the very, very best of their energy with us, we can do that in turn. And so if you'll stand with me and give a warm standing ovation to Simone Stolzoff. Welcome, Simone.
Thank you. You got to make me earn it. Thank you, Robin, for having us all here today. It's so refreshing to be in a room full of faces where there's bodies attached to the little floating Zoom heads. So as a 22-year-old senior at the University of Pennsylvania, and I was studying poetry and economics. And perhaps you can already see the makings of an existential crisis looming on the horizon. And it was around this time that I had the opportunity to interview my favorite writer in the entire world. You know, some of my classmates might have had posters of LeBron James or of Bob Marley on their wall. My poster would have been of this man. His name is Anis Mojgani. He's the current poet laureate of the state of Oregon. And he was my idol. He traveled around the world performing his poems to audiences. And so I got to ask him a few questions, and I said, you know, Anis, how do you feel about the mantra, do what you love and never work a day in your life? And I was expecting him to give me this pep talk about, you know, follow your passion, kid. And he didn't. I'll never forget what he said. He said, you know, Simone, I think some people do what they love for work, and others do what they have to, so they can do what they love when they're not working. And neither is more noble. I think that last part is key. We live in a society that loves to revere people whose jobs and identities neatly align. And here was my professional idol, a professional poet, no less, telling me that it's okay to have a day job. So naturally, being the naive 20-something that I was, I ignored his advice. I spent my 20s looking for a vocational soulmate. I played Goldilocks with these different careers. I worked in advertising for about 5 minutes, and then I worked in tech for about 10 minutes, and then I worked in food, and then I worked in journalism, all the while trying to find that job that would help me self-actualize. And it all came to a head when I was about 28 years old. I was writing for this trendy, prestigious magazine in New York, and a recruiter called from this design firm here in San Francisco called IDEO. And I was very flattered. I had never been reached out to by a recruiter before. And so, you know, always take the call. I sort of passively went through this interview experience. And then I found myself at this professional crossroads. There was one road that had, you know, Simone the journalist, and another road that had Simone the designer. Show of hands if you've ever been at a similar sort of crossroads in your career, where you could see two very different futures. Yeah, you know, on one hand, I don't expect much sympathy, you know. Oh, the agony of having to decide between two attractive job offers. But on the other, it didn't feel like I was choosing between two jobs as much as it felt like I was choosing between two versions of me. I talked to everyone I could about this. My parents, my friends, my Uber driver, my yoga teacher. I still remember the day when had to let the recruiter know, and I was outside of the Apple store in Union Square. It was Halloween. I was sort of pacing back and forth, and there were these little like witches and lions holding their parents' hands, and I was just like this caged animal, like in a state of indecision. And I think what it ultimately boiled down to, why this decision was so distressing, is that my job and my identity had become so entwined. And I knew that I wasn't the only one, here in the country where what do you do is often the first question we ask when we meet someone new, or we ask our kids what they want to be when they grow up. And so this insight that our jobs and our identities had become so entwined turned into this research project that eventually became my first book, called The Good Enough Job. In the book, I make the case for diversifying our identity, for treating work as part of, but not the entirety of who we are. And I went around the country sharing this message. I was very fortunate for it to be well received. I'd say that, when we think about work-life balance, often we think about how we spend our time. But if we want to develop a healthier relationship to work, we have to go deeper. It starts with our identity. It starts with how we conceive of who we are. And as I mentioned, I was able to give a TED Talk, and I went to all of these bookstore events. But internally, I was feeling something a little bit different. I had this professional peak, and then came the crash. It was the fall of 2023, and I was living in the most expensive city in the world, trying to make it as an author, first kid on the way, political instability, planetary uncertainty. So I started going to these weekly events at the San Francisco Zen Center called Young Urban Zen. And how it would work is the teacher would give about a 20-minute Dharma talk, a little lecture, we'd meditate, and then have a small group discussion. And in one of those sessions, the teacher told this story about a monk and his student who meet in the forest. And the monk says, "What are you doing here?" And the student says, "I'm on a pilgrimage." And the monk says, "Okay, what are you on a pilgrimage for?" And the student says, "I'm not exactly sure yet." And the monk says, "Not knowing is the most intimate." You can join me in one long Om. Not knowing is the most intimate. I knew this statement was profound. I also wasn't sure exactly what it meant. When I don't know something, the thing I feel most intimate with is Google. But over time, here's what it's come to mean for me. When we are certain, when we know something, or we think we know, say, exactly who someone is based on their political beliefs, or exactly how an emerging technology might impact your career or your business, we close our minds. But when we are uncertain, when we're able to maintain that state of not knowing, we see people as individuals as opposed to archetypes. We are able to run experiments to actually find out what we hold to be true, as opposed to making assumptions. Not knowing is the most intimate because it brings us intimate to the reality of our lives, where we can open our mind to learning. So I sort of filed that in the back of my mind. Meanwhile, I was doing these book events, and I'd inevitably get a question from the back of the room. It sounds great, Simone, but how should I think about my career with AI on the horizon? And what I wanted to shout internally was, "I don't know. I was a poetry major, for God's sakes." And I would make up some, line that would sound good. But, the good thing about being a journalist is that you don't necessarily need to have all the answers yourself. The cliche is that you write the book that you need to read. And so I took this question of uncertainty, how do we get better at dealing with what we don't know, and made it the basis for my next act. So as Robin mentioned, I wrote this book called How to Not Know. And today I'm going to tell you a little bit about the science of uncertainty, why it's so hard for us to sit with what we don't know, and then give you some principles of things I've learned along the way that might help you deal with uncertainty in your life, in your career, in your organization. Let's get into it. So biologists and economists and psychologists have all affirmed what we already know innately, which is that certainty feels good. You can imagine a prehistoric ancestor of yours. They hear a rustling in the bushes, or they reach for a berry. If they know what's making the sound, or they know that the berry is not poisonous, they feel safe and secure. It's the same reason that we like music that's based on repeating patterns. Our brains are like these prediction machines. And when prediction is easy, we feel safe. Uncertainty, on the other hand, feels bad. Professional uncertainty, for example, has been found to take a similar toll on our health as actually losing our jobs. In one of my favorite studies, participants were given a 50% chance of receiving a painful electric shock. And the people that had a 50% chance were far more stressed out than people that had an 100% chance of receiving that same shock. We would somehow rather a certain bad thing to happen than have to deal with the ambiguity of not being sure. This is particularly distressing at this moment in time. There's a study by the Economic Uncertainty Index that has looked at global uncertainty over the past 4 decades. And they found that the 5 highest points since the study began in the early 80s have occurred in the last 5 years. We live in what is called a polycrisis. There's planetary uncertainty. There's economic uncertainty, political uncertainty. Maybe you're dealing with some uncertainty in your personal life as well. And our uncertainty tolerance is decreasing. Part of this is due to the rise of the internet and mobile phones. We can now track a crisis on the other side of the globe in real time, or the real-time movements of our kids. Phones have created the expectation that answers should be readily available, that we should be able to instantly know for sure. But it's not just phones that are to blame. Imagine our young people today. They're entering into a world with a housing shortage, where a lot of the pillars like religion and long-term careers are breaking down, where they're trying to find their way in an age of an AI as entire industries are being undermined. But for a second, I want you to imagine the alternative. What if there was no uncertainty? What if we were all in these little boxes on a conveyor belt going toward a known destination? No movie would come without a spoiler. No first date would ever have the butterflies of maybe so. Uncertainty is what gives our life texture. It's what creates serendipity and surprise. The key is that we have to learn how to build uncertainty tolerance. Individuals with higher levels of uncertainty tolerance have been shown to be more innovative and creative because they're willing to tolerate the discomfort that comes from creating new things. Communities with higher levels of uncertainty tolerance tend to be more cohesive and collaborative because they're able to work together across cultural differences. And organizations with higher levels of uncertainty tolerance tend to be more innovative and resilient because they're able to tolerate the ambiguity that comes from weathering ups and downs of the economy. I'll tell you a quick story. There was this startup in the early 2000s called Glitch. It was a gaming startup, this multiplayer sort of cartoonish game, as you can see on the screen behind me. And it was doing really well. It had raised $17 million. It had tens of thousands of active users. And yet somewhere in the back of the founder's mind, he knew that the product wasn't quite right. He knew that he had this goal of trying to create a way to help people collaborate and communicate with one another. And although on paper the company seemed to be doing excellent, he had this sneaking suspicion that something needed to change. And so he did something that you might think of as crazy for a successful company with lots of money in the bank. He decided to shut the game down and make a pivot. Here's what he said. He said, "I would love to say that we knew all the answers in advance, but the truth is that we discovered our product and opportunity rather than planning for it." This founder, his name is Stuart Butterfield, and the company he ended up building is called Slack. is the fastest growing enterprise software company of all time. It sold for $28 billion to Salesforce. But the lesson from this story isn't that all is well that ends well. It's that when you're willing to tolerate uncertainty, when you're willing to turn towards what you don't know, you are able to discover the possibilities that live on the other side. No innovative piece of art, scientific breakthrough, or revolutionary company has existed without someone or a group of people's willingness to get to a place where they don't know what's coming and to keep going. So I'm going to offer you 4 different principles of things that I've learned through my research that'll help you deal with this uncertainty and leave you with 4 questions. It wouldn't be a talk without uncertainty, without lots of question marks. Principle the first, find your anchors. This is Twyla Tharp. She's one of the most innovative choreographers of our era. And although she's known for these genre-busting pieces of music and dance, every single day of hers looks roughly the same. She wakes up at 5:30 a.m. She takes a taxi to the gym, which is very New York. She works out with her trainer for 2 hours, comes back home, eats 3 hard-boiled egg whites. She takes calls for an hour, rehearses in her studio for 2 hours, and then rehearses with her company for 3 hours and comes home. She eats dinner, reads for an hour, and goes to sleep. She attributes the innovation in her dances to the regularity of her routine. Having certainty about some aspects of your life makes it easier to hold uncertainty in others. She says that before you can think outside of the box, you have to start with a box. So my question for you is, what are some aspects of your life and business that will remain the same amidst all that is changing? Maybe for your business, it's your company values, or your mission, or the people that you're hoping to serve. Maybe for you as an individual, it's something like where I want to live, or who I want to be partnered to, or what is the question that I want to dedicate my life to trying to answer. But when we are certain about some aspects of our life, we're easier able to hold uncertainty in others. Find your anchors. 2, build to learn. If I were to create a playbook for success in sort of the old world of business, it would look something like this. Plan, execute, get your desired results. But I've worked in the corporate world for many years, and I know that it more often looks like this. Plan, get feedback from a dozen people, and then the project gets lost in some Bermuda Triangle of bureaucratic limbo. This model is outdated. It's increasingly costly to upfront all of the planning before you start to execute. At IDEO, where I cut my teeth, we used to have a saying, never come to a meeting without a prototype. The idea was, rather than talk about what we wanted to build, start by building it, and then give people something tangible to react to. When my wife and I were about to have our first kid, we had these meetings with our doctor. And I remember coming into one of the first meetings, and we had this very pristine birth plan of exactly how we wanted things to go. I see some parents in the room laughing me off the stage. And the midwife said, "Oh, very cute. Is it your first?" And we said, yes, sheepishly. And she says, rarely does everything go to plan. Rather than think about making a birth plan, I would think about birth preferences. There are many organizations that hold this mantra dear. NASA, for example, when they're planning for a project, says, this is a plan from which we will deviate. There's an acknowledgement that the plan that you made in your Q3 meeting to plan for Q1 of next year probably won't go exactly to plan. So rather than spend all of your time planning, this is a model of success in today's business. Build first, and then adapt. I'll show you an example of this in practice. So at IDEO, we were building an app for Sesame Street, for Elmo in particular. And rather than spend weeks and weeks creating a software prototype, potentially costing us thousands of dollars, this is what the team did.
So this is possible dance moves for monster making. So music starts, and I'm the player, so I come in and I touch the monster, and he gives me a special dance move. I go and touch again, and he does a different one. And it can go for as long as I want. It has a few signature moves. And when I've had enough and I'm done dancing, I push the back button, it pauses, and the music stops. Monster making.
Cool.
Sonic. Come on, Sonic.
Whoa!
Wow.
So rather than spend weeks and weeks trying to create the software prototype to show the client, the team cut out a piece of cardboard. And in 5 minutes, we're able to show the desired user experience. Build to learn. It's the fastest way to build, especially in an uncertain environment. So the question is, what is a time-bound, low-cost experiment that can teach you what you hope to learn? Rather than creating a thought experiment in your mind, how can you run an experiment in the world that can teach you what you hope to learn? If you're considering moving to a new place, maybe you book an Airbnb and live there for a week and see how it actually feels. If you're considering launching a new product, can you create a low fidelity prototype and actually put it in front of customers? The fastest way to learn is to build. 3, trust in your future self to solve your future problems. There's a friend of mine and a friend of Responsive's named Emily Anhalt. She's a clinical psychologist, but before she started working with entrepreneurs and leaders and helping them navigate uncertainty and change, she was in her early 20s when her mom was given a potentially terminal diagnosis. She spent weeks sitting by her mom's bedside, trying to figure out how she might cope. And she told me she would ride this sort of roller coaster of anticipatory grief and fear. One day, a family friend of hers named Bill came by to check on her and see how she was doing. Bill is an oncology doctor, so he has lots of experience dealing with people near the end of their life. And so he asked Emily, "How are you doing?" And she said, "Honestly, not very well. I have no idea what I'll do if my mom dies. I'm not sure how I'll be able to handle it." And Bill said something that has stuck with Emily and myself to this day. He said, "Emily, the person who will deal with that unthinkable tragedy if and when it happens will be born into existence in that moment. And that person will have more life experience, more context, and will be better equipped to deal with that tragedy if it comes. You have to trust your future self to solve your future problems." So often, when faced with uncertainty, we rush out to meet our suffering. We think about the worst case scenario. We try and think of everything that we possibly can do today to prepare. And yet often, we are giving our attention and our energy to forces that we cannot control. There was this Stoic philosopher in the 2nd century named Epictetus. And he said, you have to divide the world into 2 parts: that which you can control and that which you can't. From the former, withdraw your effort and give your effort to the latter. It's an early precursor from what you might know as the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So the question is, what is something causing you stress that you have no power to influence today? I think about this all the time in relation to the climate crisis. There are things that we can all do individually to help make a difference. And yet, if you are just focused on all the things that you can't control, it leads to paralysis and anxiety. The thing that alchemizes anxiety into hope is action. We must do things that are in our power to control. Principle 4. Choose curiosity over fear. There's this parable about a Chinese farmer. And one day his horse runs away from the small village in which he lives. And his neighbors all come to his door and they say, "We're so sorry to hear about your horse. What a tragedy." And the farmer says, "Maybe yes, maybe no." The next day the horse comes back. And in tow there are 7 wild horses behind it. And again, the neighbors come back to the farmer's door and they say, "What luck! You now have these 8 horses." And the farmer says, "Maybe yes, maybe no." The day after that, the farmer's son is out riding one of the wild horses, and he falls and he breaks his leg. And again, the neighbors return to him and they say, "We're so sorry to hear about your son. It's such a bummer." And the farmer says, "Maybe yes, maybe no." And the following day, a general from the Chinese military comes to the small town to conscript people into the army. And because the son has broken his leg, he's able to avoid the draft. And once again, the neighbors come to his house and say, "What luck, you're so fortunate." And this time you can say it with me, maybe yes, maybe no. When we're faced with uncertainty, we often have this inclination to go to one of 2 extremes, to assume the best case scenario or to assume the worst. I see this all the time with AI. Probably half the room imagines that we're entering this age of unprecedented productivity, this utopia where a lot of our rote tasks will be automated that will free us up to do more high-level thinking and work. Some others of you might think that we're entering a dystopia. There'll be mass layoffs and this class warfare will leave the world a much worse place. And in these moments, I want you to remember the wisdom of the farmer, to reserve the right to make judgments about how the future might look. I'll give you 2 reasons. The first comes from this guy. His name is Phil Tetlock. He's a psychology researcher and professor. And he's dedicated his life to studying how people make forecasts, how they make predictions about the future. And he gathered data from a decade of the top experts, government officials, economists, journalists, and their predictions about how the future would look. And then he checked those forecasts based on reality of what actually happened. His conclusion does not mince words. The average expert was roughly as accurate as a dart-throwing chimpanzee. If you are certain about exactly how the future will look, I can guarantee that you're wrong. The second is that we're in a room full of change makers. We're in a room full of people who want to influence the world for the better, through their work, through their organizations. And when we are certain about exactly what the future will look like, it's disempowering. If you're certain about the future, it leaves you without the power to change it. So the question that I want to leave you with is, what are something that you used to be certain about that is no longer true? How can you learn to trade your hubris for humility as we walk into this unknown world? 4 principles. Find your anchors. Build to learn. Trust in your future self to solve your future problems. And choose curiosity over fear. I want to end with a metaphor that I learned during my time at IDEO. Being an innovator is like rowing a boat on a lake that's shrouded in heavy fog. You can't see exactly where you're going. You can't know exactly where you'll end up. But you have two jobs. One is to maintain faith that you'll eventually reach land. Remember, you're on a lake. And the second is to keep rowing. So that's my wish for you, Responsive Conference, as you go out into the next 2 days and into the world outside afterwards, is that you keep rowing. And remember that you can see just as far as anyone else. Thank you.